Hi, I'm Joshua Blakeney. I'm here with my fellow activist, Aaron Doncaster. He and I posted a video on YouTube this week, which caused quite a stir in the activist community here in Calgary, where we alleged that some members on the left, some activists here in Calgary, some participants in Occupy Calgary, and other otherwise progressive people in the Calgary activist community had been misguided into supporting a reactionary and imperialist agenda vis-a-vis Syria. Many have now come to the conclusion that there has been an attempt to convince left-wing people and conscript progressive people into endorsing an imperialist, a destabilization project that's kind of reminiscent of the attempts to sabotage socialism in Latin America in the context of the Cold War and indeed today. Of course, in Latin America, many sought to emulate the fine example of Fidel Castro and the Cuban revolutionaries who liberated Cuba from reaction and imperialism in 1959. Many sought to emulate that. We think of Salvador Allende in Chile and many others who sought to emulate Cuba's revolution, but who were victims of imperialist destabilization projects. The death squads in Latin America are notorious in the Cold War, but yet today we see death squads being sent into Syria, and yet many progressive people have been conscripted into endorsing the waving of the three-starred flag. Of course, the three-starred flag was the flag of French imperialists. After Sykes-Picot in 1915, 1916, the French got a mandate over Syria and they erected the three-starred flag. And when Syria attained independence and attained autonomy, they established the two-starred flag, the flag that is emblematic of pan-Arabism, of Arab self-determination, the people of the Middle East deciding their own fate and forging their own futures rather than having it decided for them by Western statesmen such as John Baird, the foreign minister here in Canada, who thinks he has a right to decide the fate of the Syrian people, where most Syrians would rally behind their president's gradualist transition to democracy and assertion of Syrian sovereignty with tanks and bombs, of course, and guns and ammunition as power requires. The imperialists have tanks and military hardware, and so do the anti-imperialists. They are the realities of power, and platitudes about compassion and wishy-washy diagnoses of what's happening in the Middle East negates any political engagement. And so, Aaron, let me know what you think about this, please.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the idea of compassion and platitudes. I think the idea that somehow anti-imperialists aren't compassionate, I think that was made by some people, some of our critics, is kind of ridiculous, because intrinsic in an anti-imperialist stance is the idea for self-determination, compassion for the people. And I find it interesting that, forget about the imperialism of the past, but let's talk about the imperialism of today, just recently. So let's pick Yugoslavia, let's pick Libya, let's pick Iraq, both Gulf War I, Gulf War II, and let's pick Syria. So so-called progressives often, I find, have compassion, or what they say is compassion, for people under the authority of regimes that don't purport to fall under the dictates of Western capitalism or the United Nations system of accounts. And so a lot of these so-called progressives will say they have compassion, but after the deed is done, after the imperialist war and the civil war that happens afterwards, the fragmentation that happens afterwards, the sectarianism that happens afterwards, and the suffering that's the consequence of it, is negated by those people, those so-called progressives who said they had compassion in the first place. So now you see in Kosovo, the KLA that was basically started by a bunch of terrorists, now having a mafia-style hegemony over that area, and nobody talks about that. You see in Libya, after the overthrow and the death of a so-called pariah, a pariah who supported the PLO, was a supporter of the Palestinian cause, was a supporter of Pan-Africanism, was a leader of a country that was debt-free, that brought the living standard to the highest of all in Africa. You see afterwards, after the deed was done of the imperialist war, you see a fragmentation, you see a sectarianism. And so, like, where are all those people that had the compassion before for this so-called, dictator? Where are they now? People are dying now in Libya as a result of this imperialist war and as a result of the fragmentation and the sectarianism. So where are these people? You look at the first Gulf War, where people, so-called progressives, were bamboozled by Hilton and Knowlton, I think was the PR company, with that ridiculous claim that babies were being thrown out of incubators. So where are those people that were so compassionate beforehand? Now, when after that war, Madeleine Albright said 500,000 deaths were worth it. So where are those people? So it's like I take issue with the claim that people are being compassionate for human life when you don't see any compassion for the people from so-called progressives after this dirty imperialist deed was done.
Well, I think implicit to what we're saying, Aaron, is that the positions people take on these matters of life and death, the positions people take on the geopolitics of the Middle East, they matter. And people can't just go to a protest and endorse what turns out to be a nefarious and reactionary imperialist project and then claim to be innocent and impartial on this issue. And I think the positions left-wing people take matters. And, the cure has to be better than the disease. That's basically what Aaron and I are saying, that if you offer a prescription for Syria, it has to improve things. If you offered a prescription, if you said I'm going to do regime change in Saudi Arabia, where currently people have quite subsidized healthcare and so on, I don't support the Saudi government in any way, shape or form. But if you said I'm going to invade and do regime change in Saudi Arabia, and the product was that 5 million Saudis would be killed, I'd have to not support that. Today we were purchasing a coffee, Aaron and I, and this Kurdish girl said, actually, I supported the invasion of Iraq. It made things better. And I had to turn around and say, well, Gideon Polar of the Australian National University has deduced that 2.3 million extra Iraqis would be alive today. 2.3 million Iraqis had their lives denied to them as a result of the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003. So it's not much better for them. 2 million of them dead. That's not an improvement for them. And for the 4 million that are refugees, of course, that was a regression rather than a progression. And of course, many of those refugees who were scattered to the four corners of the planet due to Tony Blair and George Bush and their paymasters' unlawful invasion of Iraq, many of those refugees ended up on the streets of Damascus, begging as paupers on the streets of Damascus. And so it's fresh in the mind of Syrian people, the implications of imperialist wars of aggression. They know that despite all the propaganda, despite all the rhetoric, and despite all the censorship by omission that happens in the media, where these unscrupulous journalists promote these wars of aggression and then don't report the negative implications of the wars that they were so keen to see being meted out on the people of the Middle East. And so we would say that the cure has to be better than the disease. If you went to the doctor and he gave you a palliative that killed you, it wouldn't be a palliative. And likewise, the solutions that are offered for Syria and any dearth of democracy that exists in Syria has to improve the situation. And of course, we have to remember, my country of Britain, my country of origin, when we were fighting fascism in Europe, all democracy was suspended. There were no elections when we were at war against Nazism. If you'd walked down the street proselytizing for the enemy, you would have been lynched by the state. And likewise in countries like Cuba and Syria, when they're confronted by countries that go to the other side of the world, to Vietnam and to around the world bombing and setting fire to people's countries, when we see Israel right next door to Syria that stole a segment of Syria's territories in 1967, when we see the United States, the world's global hegemon, the behemoth, looking down upon Syria and offering regime change when they just did it to Libya just next door, is it surprising that there's some dearth of democracy there? Tell me, Aaron, what do you think?
Well, I think it's interesting, your first comment with respect to what is the alternative, and I think a lot of people on the so-called left, so-called progressives, need to ask themselves, is this an example of a tyrant repressing, the peasantry, or is this a asymmetrical vying for power by different sects, and I think if you look into Syria, what's happening is not that it's the working class that is up in arms. I think what you'll find is that the Free Syrian Army is engaged in a power struggle with the Assad regime, and vying for power. And if you look who they are, there's no real concern for the well-being and the self-determination of Syria. There's just a small sect that is supported by terrorists and mercenaries, that want some sort of regime change, and possibly for the sheer fact that Assad is such an anti-imperialist. I think it's important for the imperialists to actually have stooges in place that do their bidding, and they can't deal with the fact that Assad is not a stooge for them. Assad will not do the bidding for the West. Assad will actually stand up and say, no, this is our country. We deserve to create our own reality. We have a right to self-determination, and we will not be told to dance to your tune.
Well, and of course, Syria was feudal prior to the liberation of the peasantry from feudalism by the Ba'ath Party. And one of my close friends, her family apparently were kind of nobles traditionally in Syria, and her family complained about, Assad and the Ba'ath Party allowed peasants to run Damascus because, of course, many people who were bound to the land, bound to the feudal relations that existed prior to the Ba'ath Party, were liberated. And I would say our socialist ideology is kind of rooted in Enlightenment thought, Aaron. The idea there is a continuum of progress. There is an idea of reactionaries and progressives. There is that we can have these categories, and that the idea that things have to progress and things have to improve, and that humanity is always going somewhere, and it can either be made worse or it can be made better. And I would say that our whole goal is to see the improvement, and self-determination is a prerequisite for that progressiveness. And I would say that the raison d'etre of the neoconservatives, the whole post 9/11 worldview, has been to try and sell us wars of aggression under the rubric of democratization. Of course, historically, imperialism was sold to us as they were going to Christianize the heathens, and then it was civilize the savages. But now it's the jargon phrase, the propaganda term is democratization. That the people of the Middle East aren't quite grown up enough. They're not quite responsible enough to democratize themselves. They need statesmen in Washington and Tel Aviv and London and Paris deciding their fate for them. It's kind of benevolent imperialists who have a kind of white man's burden to try and reorder the Middle East in a way that's conducive. That's highly patronizing and degrading, and I think that we have to be careful not to have what Aaron has termed anti-Arab racism on the left, where I think there's a lot of people on the left ensconced in Western countries who really don't actually appreciate the subtleties of the Middle East, don't really give a damn about the people of the Middle East, frankly. I think a lot of people allow themselves to be incorporated into these anti-government protests against President Assad, having not actually developed a full appreciation for the complexities of the Middle East. And I think really, if you don't give a damn about the Middle East, that's fine, but you should not try and express opinions on Middle East politics if you haven't actually bothered to go through the literature of what's going on there, not bothered to try and talk to the many Syrians, for example, who support their government's gradual transition to democracy. And so, of course, Syria has a new constitution. Syria's had elections in recent weeks, and so we have to oppose Western statesmen going to Syria and making things worse, whether covertly through the sponsoring of death squads and reactionary troops. Many of those snipers who Syrians have complained of, and who, of course, many Syrians in the early days, for example, November 2011, were protesting Assad not bringing in the tanks to extirpate the black-clad snipers who were shooting at their children from rooftops. And so we see many Syrians who support their government who are against the reactionaries who are shooting at them. And so we have to side with the right people in this. And I think that there's a lot of utopianism on the left, and maybe you would agree with this, Aaron, that the choice isn't between some utopian perfect Syria where the working class have pure equality and own the means of production and so on, as many leftists would love to see. if we're being honest and actually trying to engage in the political realities, the realpolitik, the dichotomy is between President Assad's gradual transition to democracy and the expunging of those reactionary terrorists who are seeking to destabilize Syria at the behest of Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and of course France and Israel and the United States and Britain. The choice is between Assad and reaction. The choice is not between some utopian Syria and the status quo. And we have to face the fact that Syria is next to one of the most militant and aggressive states on the planet. Of course, Zionist Israel, which is, it's a clone of Nazi Germany in so many ways. It's expansionist. It seeks to destabilize its neighbors. It seeks regional hegemony. And it stole some of Syria's land in 1967. These are the realities that President Assad has indefatigably stood up against, and we should not, renounce those who are the remnants of the Pan-Arabist movement that Gamal Abdel Nasser was a protagonist of. We should not denounce those more reasonable and rational elements within the Middle East, more democratic than Saudi Arabia, more democratic than reactionary Qatar, who are seeking to forge their own path in life. And we see a multipolar world emerging, and perhaps you could speak to that, Aaron.
Well, I think it's important that that people look at what we've been sold here in the West with respect to democracy. This idea that, bourgeois elections and, that Western free market capitalism equates to democracy is a result of us having our minds colonized by the powers that be, in order for their agendas of imperialism to actually be more effective. And so I think one of the most important things that we need to look at is whether or not we can effectively decolonize our minds, from this Western Eurocentric language that is almost racist, and I think we can decolonize our mind. And then once we decolonize our mind, we realize that, what we've been sold on this idea of democracy from the West with, bourgeois elections and, with the free market capitalism, the worship of private property, individual freedom without social responsibility that is propagated by Western capitalism, we've realized that, this is not real. And then I think from there we can see that, maybe other countries have a right to build something that's an alternative. Maybe countries should not be forced under this idea of white man's burden, under this idea that, the UN with their United Systems of Account, the US with their hegemonic control should impose this Western version of capitalism on people. I think that if you truly look at self-determination and autonomy, you'll realize that a lot of the countries that were, thrown into an imperialist war, not just since the advent of America, but even recently, with the examples I put forth, Yugoslavia, Libya, Iraq, potentially going to be Iran, potentially Venezuela if we don't step up. You'll see that these countries all had something in common, that they tried to build an alternative that wasn't to the tune of Western imperialist countries, and I think it's important that we struggle with these people so that they have a right to put forth their own path, to develop their own country the way they want to see it developed.
Well, I think what you...
Again, before you go on, I want to make it clear. So I think it's important that people realize, that it is a prerequisite to fight the imperialist aggressor. If you want democracy, if you want a democratic society, you cannot have a democratic society if you don't first fight the bigger evil, which is that imperialist aggressor. And if you look at the anti-imperialists in in Syria, I don't think you'll find any of them, claiming that that the Assad regime is perfect. But like you said, what is the alternative? Is the alternative, a Western version of democracy? That's not democracy. So I think it's important that we actually look at what the alternative would be before we actually go into supporting, agendas of different countries. Because what's happening now is that, it's just regime change to open up markets for the Western imperialists. And, what's going to happen is the same thing that happened in Libya, same thing that happened in Yugoslavia. There's going to be suffering, there's going to be sectarianism, and any attempt by any country to build self-determination, to build autonomy, is going to be that much harder if countries and us in the West, who are so-called leftists, the so-called leftists in the West, the so-called progressives, we need to unite together to fight the imperialist aggressor, because if we don't, then they're going to target them one by one, and the more they target, the more they gain hegemony. The more they realize their own agenda, which is total globalization according to the dictates of Western capitalism, and the harder it is for progressive regions on the globe to actually be a bulwark against this in the future, and I think a lot of people out there will realize that we're coming to a stage in society where we realize that self-determination and autonomy needs to be respected, and there's no, as far as I'm concerned, the best and most effective way to respect self-determination and autonomy is to fight against imperialism.
Yeah, and I think the point also is that there's some elements of democracy in Canada, and there's a lot of anti-democratic elements in Canada, and the latter is increasingly more egregious in this country. And likewise in Syria, there are some victories for democracy in Syria. Bread is subsidized in Syria. I gather that you can buy 2 kilos of bread for 20 cents, equivalent of 20 US cents. School is free from infancy to PhD. School uniform is free. The ride to school and back is free. School dinners at school is free. There's a motto in Syria that no child goes to bed hungry. These are human rights too, right? Like a child being able to eat every day, bread being affordable. These are democratic rights too. Democracy is not a matter of literally going and putting your X on a piece of paper every 4 years. Democracy, if we're thinking socialistically, is far more nuanced and deep than that, and should be more deep than that. And in Syria, I gather if you're poor, the state will cover your car insurance. If you're poor, the state will cover your healthcare. Indeed, I believe every citizen has access to basic healthcare. Some of my Syrian friends have said the healthcare in Syria is better than that in Canada. And that they've had worse experiences with the healthcare system, less conscientiousness and more profit and cost saving being visible in the Canadian system than in the Syrian system. Having access to healthcare and education, these are all totems of a democracy too. And I think the idea that in our society is like they'll privatize everything. They'll hand everything off to the corporate world, but we'll get to put our piece of paper, an X on a piece of paper to choose between Tweedledee and Tweedledum at an election every few years, and therefore we have a democracy. And so for us to be going around the world when there's an increasing democratic deficit in our own countries, trying to give some blueprint for democracy in other countries where anyone who's read the theory of decolonization, after World War II, Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, Nelson Mandela, there was much talk in Africa, especially of doing one-party democracy. And I think that's what Baathism kind of attempted, one-party democracy, trying to have disputes and debates and, you know, the rough and tumble of political dispute, but within the context of one party. I think there's often an idea that multi-party democracy is the only democratic solution that can be offered for anti-democratic countries. But, you know, the problem is that creates division and often allows the working class to be divided and ruled, you know.
And not only that, but the idea that multi-party democracies or multi-party parliamentary systems are are democratic is interesting in and of itself, because some may claim that the multi-parties are just different factions of the same party. You know, so
Or different factions of the ruling class
exactly.
throw their lot in with different parties, right?
Exactly. So, like, how is that democratic? And I mean, just recently the UN came out and, you know, they slammed Canada for our food insecurity. And over the last, you know, since Harper's been elected, last election, a lot of people said was stolen. Even if you can, you know, ignore the fact that, you know, there was that robocall scandal. That you know, sent a lot of people away from the polls that wouldn't have voted for the Conservatives. The fact is, only about 61% people voted, and out of that, 40% voted for the Conservatives. Ergo, you get 24% roughly. So, like,
24% voted for Harper.
Yes.
So 76% of Canadians did not vote for the Canadian Prime Minister.
Exactly. So, how real democratic is that? You know, so you know, claiming that you know, Canada is a bastion for democracy is a result of people having their minds colonized by this Eurocentric version, you know, this Eurocentric idea that all our organizational structures are great, you know, and I think there may be a bit of you know, racism involved there, you know, and
So just give me your message to the activists in Calgary. What would be your message to them, Aaron?
Well, my message to activists in Calgary are to, you know, be willing to, don't be afraid to, you know, question authority. You know, that is, you know, questioning the authority of the mainstream media, of the Western powers. You know, question the ideas of imperialism. You know, I think it's important that we make it clear that imperialism is something real. It is not some kind of, you know, namby-pamby, you know, ambiguous thing that is you know, a socially constructed idea. It's a real thing that has real consequences, and I think it's important for people to ask themselves, you know, so-called progressives, to ask themselves, is the death and destruction of imperialism, you know, worth ignoring, you know, all to follow an agenda that is essentially pro-imperialist, you know? I mean, this idea that the Assad regime is some kind of tyrant that is, you know, keeping down the peasantry, is a result of, you know, the corruption within the mainstream media, you know. So I mean, supporting him is really supporting this Western agenda essentially means that you have the death of imperialism, the blood of imperialism on your hands, you know. So
you read an essay recently where she was kind of arguing that, you know, authoritarianism can kill hundreds, but imperialism kills millions, and thus, if we want to actually engage in the real political debate, the real political debate is, either or. It is binary. We might not like binary constructs, but that is a reality. The choice is you're with the person who may kill hundreds, or you're with the person who's going to kill millions. And if you offer utopian platitudes about compassion and a utopian society that we all wish a utopia would come into fruition in Syria, but if you offer such prescriptions for Syria, you're not engaging in the political reality. The political reality is a choice between the status quo or something worse. Is that?
Yeah, and I once heard it said that somebody asked me, a friend of mine asked me, I want to know what the occupier, the member of Occupy in Syria would do. Well, people in Syria don't have that choice. It just goes to show that question. Goes to show the sheer ignorance of the cultural situation, the idiosyncrasies, the situation on the ground, as it were, in Syria. That they don't even talk about like an Occupy Syria. It's just not. You can't equate Occupy in a Western imperialist country with Syria, or with anti-imperialist countries. Like, it's those privileges that we have here don't exist in an imperialized country. So it's true. It's like you said, it's either or.
Yeah, and also I think the point is that there's a racism in the idea that you always have to blame the Arab strongman. You always have to blame the Arabs, and there's this complete denial of Zionist power in the Middle East. A complete denial there's this nuclear-powered cuckoo in the nest, which Ashkenazi European Jews came and settled in the Middle East and built this nuclear state, which is creating an asymmetry in the Middle East. After World War II, there was a real attempt for Arab self-determination, and maybe they would have become, perfect democracies had it not been for the fact you have this Israeli state in the Middle East, and the constant imperative is to create what Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was the revisionist Zionist, who was the kind of philosophical father of the Likud party, who runs Israel now, the incumbent Likud party led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It was well documented that they want a Jewish empire. They want an Israeli Zionist empire in the Middle East. And just as the British wanted a British empire. And so to try and talk about what's happening in Syria without acknowledging Israeli power, we've been kind of trained by liberal Zionists like Amy Goodman, and surprise, surprise, Democracy Now! Is promoting the destabilization of Syria, just as Amy Goodman denied the obvious 9/11 false flag attack, which has Israeli fingerprints all over it. You see left-wing people time and time again being fooled into supporting an agenda of blaming the Arabs for all the problems in the Middle East, when in reality there is Israel in the Middle East, which has hegemony, which is one of the most powerful militaries on the earth, has one of the most intricate and elaborate intelligence agencies in the world, Mossad, the Israeli Mossad, and we're not allowed to talk about this. And then there's such an ignorance of Israeli power on the left. We've been trained by liberal Zionists to deny Israeli power, deny Zionist power, deny the fact that not only is there this Israeli colonial state in the Middle East distorting everything, creating an asymmetry, making life difficult for Syrian people and Egyptian people. Not only do they have their state in the Middle East, they also have many, many capitalists in North America and Britain and France who devote a large swathes of their capital and a great deal of their time to lobbying for policies that are conducive to Zionist hegemony in the Middle East. And it's the imperative for the Israelis to have hegemony in the Middle East, which is stimulating all the discord and dissension in the Middle East that we see on a day-to-day basis. And so to constantly try and blame the Arabs for the problem in the Middle East, when all the Arabs wanted to do was rid themselves of British colonialism, rid themselves of French colonialism, and now, of course, rid themselves of the Israeli cuckoo in the nest and have self-determination, to blame them for the lack of democracy in their country, when the Israelis have gone around blowing up mosques, blowing up churches, doing false flag attacks left, right, and center in order to create sectarianism, in order to create divisions and fissures and factionalism to weaken the Arab and Muslim states. Is astonishing that the left constantly blame the Arabs. It can only be a kind of Eurocentric, social Darwinist, a relic of social Darwinism in our thought that kind of European people are a little bit more democratic, European people are a little bit smarter, a little bit more superior. And of course Zionism is the embodiment of that social Darwinist thought, the notion that Jewish people are more intelligent, more superior, made the desert bloom in the Middle East. All this Eurocentric rhetoric that we see emanating from from Israel that many on the left, thanks to liberal Zionists like Chomsky and Amy Goodman, have been trained to prescribe to, that kind of supremacism that is equivalent to kind of the Aryan Guards worldview, but merely being legitimated in foreign policy lobby groups like the American Enterprise Institute and so on. That we need to address this seriously on the left.
Yeah, I mean, I think if people look at the Ariel Sharon doctrine and the attempts to balkanize the Middle East, and they actually look at the history of Zionism. There are Zionists out there who have made comments. There's one comment in particular where a Zionist is quoted as saying, "I'd rather send 5,000 German Jews to their death and 5,000 to Israel than to see 10,000 go to Britain." And so there you see that even within within the Zionist movement, you'll see the hypocrisy, the fact that Zionism isn't about Jewish the Jewish people. If Zionism was about the Jewish people, then there would be support for a protection of Yiddish self-determination. But no, I mean, the Yiddish community was basically, ignored, for this idea that we've got to colonize the Middle East because there's this land without a people for a people without a land, and this is just it was a propaganda that was allowed to go forth. And, people on the left and so-called progressives, I think it's important that they study Zionism and see what Zionism is, and see the effects of the Sharon doctrine and the what has happened with the balkanization of the Middle East, with the Iraq war, Gulf War I, Gulf War II, and I think when people look at that, they'll realize that there are evil plans afoot by the powers that be. There are agendas by the powers that be.
Could you tell me, Aaron, do you think it's surprising that left-wing people are very keen and willing to go along with demonizing and ostracizing and attacking an Arab leader, but then we don't see any anti-Zionist discord from many leftists? We don't see a very active anti-Zionist movement among many activists. Could it be that they've been trained to prescribe to certain Zionist mythologies about Middle Eastern people?
I think if you look at the mainstream media, since 9/11 and their Islamophobia, I think you'll find that they've been very effective in manufacturing ideas within the left and the so-called progressives out there. And I think it's important for people to look at alternatives to that mainstream narrative that is pro-imperialist. And there are alternatives out there.